and Walt Disney made his career building on other people's creativity. Disney's Mickey Mouse was born out of Steamboat Willie. Steamboat Willie is a cartoon made just months after Buster Keaton's Steamboat Bill Jr. Both of them follow a kind of similar comedic structure to the way that they play their work out, and both reflect the culture of the time, which was to recognize creativity always builds on the past, always builds on other kinds of creativity. I think that's important and good, and I commend Disney for their work. Not that I think all of it's great, but I think it's a great practice of freedom that we ought to continue to preserve. The irony is that the Disney Corporation, as distinct from Walt Disney, is now making it so that nobody can do to Disney what Disney did to the Brothers Grimm, by making it so that copyright rules restrict the opportunity of people to build on Disney's work, even though Disney built upon other people's work. And that's what I think is fundamentally wrong. In a world that, especially in the United States, is dominated by these commercial icons of culture, the idea that we're not free to build upon it is bad enough, but it adds insult to injury when you recognize that all of these aspects of commercial culture were themselves the creation of building on other work that had gone before. So I think we should just rediscover the extraordinary importance of that freedom and guarantee it for everybody, not just those that happen to be able to afford expensive lawyers.
Taking a bigger picture, a lot of people, especially with regards to some stories out of South Africa and Europe, are complaining that their own culture is being annihilated through a lot of the big corporations putting in McDonald's or Gap stores in every little town across Europe and South Africa. Would that also be a part of stealing culture?
Well, I think it is an important concern, but the thing to recognize is that that kind of cultural dominance is the inevitable consequence of this strengthening of intellectual property regimes, that they go hand in hand. Because to the extent you strengthen these IP regimes and make it harder for other cultures to produce and spread their work, you make it easier for the dominant cultural forces like the United States to continue to have its influence. So one of the things we hope that Creative Commons might do as it spreads internationally is make it easier for culture internationally to be spread and understood and compete with this dominant Hollywood model. So one of the most important supporters of the Creative Commons movement has been Gilberto Gil, who's the culture minister of Brazil and a very famous musician from Brazil. And his recognition was that if more Brazilian music was available under a Creative Commons license, that would spread Brazilian music much more broadly than it is being spread today under the traditional methods by which copyrighted material gets spread. And that would benefit Brazilian musicians. And it's that insight, I think, that we're trying to get more people to recognize, that in fact this system could help level the playing field so the great cultural contributions of many nations can spread internationally and not just the powerful forces from the United States.
So you would say that Creative Commons perhaps will increase exponentially in the developing countries at the moment as opposed to the developed countries?
I think its most important contribution right now is going to be in the context of developing nations. We've first of all launched a licensing project called the Developing Nations Licensing Project that makes it possible for people from developed nations to mark their content with a license that says, in a developing nation, you're free to do with this what you want, but outside of a developing nation, ordinary rules apply. Now, that's an important first step, because most creators in developed nations have no potential market and have no desire to try to control a market in developing nations, and they would be happy to free their content to developing nations and thereby cause that not to be piracy anymore when people in developing nations build upon that. So that's first thing. But more important than that is to be able to encourage more creators from around the world to enter into this space for cultural creativity. So if your creativity is marked with a Creative Commons license, it becomes easier for it to spread out of your own country and be picked up and recognized around the world. Now, what that eventually does, of course, is drive demand for your underlying product. So if you release music under a non-commercial license that permits people to share the music but not to sell it, and your music then becomes famous and loved around the world, then record labels will seek you out to be able to find and sign you up for a record contract so that you can begin to sell your music internationally. But the point was, you would never have been identified as a great success or potentially great successful musician had it not been for the opportunity for your music to spread broadly. So one of the most important lessons here is that a more flexible system is actually important in supporting especially those who don't already have the great machinery of American marketing behind their work.
I want to quickly touch upon the aspect of record companies. Once an artist perhaps is ready to go to that big record company, a lot of people say that those record companies are trying to take away that individual's copyright. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think that we have forgotten an extremely important part of the copyright regime, and that was that copyright, in the Anglo-American tradition at least, was intended to grant authors control, not publishers. But that ideal of granting control to authors has been eroded as companies around the world have increasingly insisted that authors have to sign away all of their rights before they have any right to participate in the distribution system that these publishers have created. So musicians in the United States face this all the time. In order to release their record, they're going to have to sign away so many other records to this one label. And if it turns out they're not a success, according to the label won't free them to do their work elsewhere. So they become sharecroppers of the existing record label system. Now, that might have been necessary under the old economics of the way records were produced. Records were extremely expensive, marketing records was extremely expensive, and they really needed to assure that they could control and produce hits. But it's not necessary anymore to control the distribution of content like that. And one of the things we hope Creative Commons will do will be to revive this ideal that it's authors who should control what happens to their creative work, and they should take responsibility for assuring that they maintain their copyrights so that they have some control over how their culture gets spread, and not, a few companies. Now there's basically 4 that control over 85% of the distribution of music in the world, so that just not these few companies get to decide what really merits spread of culture internationally.
You referred to distribution with regards to these record companies, and a lot of record companies would say, with that extent of distribution and the channels that they've created, they deserve most of that copyright.
Yeah, I don't think they deserve anything other than what the free market would give them. And I think what we're seeing is the efforts by record companies to use their power, both lobbying power and market power, to destroy competition so that they don't have to face competition in the marketplace. So I have no problem with record companies making lots of money on a level playing field where there are lots of other competing opportunities for musicians to spread their music. And if in that world they make all the money in the world, then I'm happy for them. But what I oppose is the idea that the law should reinforce one particular way to distribute content and disable all the other potential ways that could compete with that. So record companies deserve the right to compete in the marketplace just like anybody else does, but anybody else deserves the same right that the record companies have.
Record companies, the big ones, have said that MP3s hurt their bottom line the last couple of years. Would you agree with that?
I think record companies think competition hurts their bottom line, as any company does. And so every company tries to fight competition. There's been no independent study of MP3s that demonstrate any substantial harm that they're causing to the record companies. In fact, in Europe, record sales go up even though MP3 downloads also go up. So I think that we should step away from the kind of war rhetoric that the record labels have spun around this, something my friend Jack Valenti calls his own terrorist war, where apparently our children are the terrorists, and be a little bit more balanced and reasonable in understanding how this potential for peer-to-peer file sharing could actually be the beginning of a brand new industry, much more competitive, much more diverse internationally, and much more vibrant in supporting the underlying authors and also consumers in the spreading and access to culture. I think the rhetoric around war that dominates too much in the United States right now is really destroying a great opportunity that the Internet would give to consumers and authors and creators internationally.
So you would say that that kind of rhetoric is a type of propaganda then?
Well, it's an understandable propaganda. Competition is something all businesses try to avoid. But what's bizarre to me is that policymakers in the United States, and more bizarrely internationally, are so quick to buy this totally predictable party line on behalf of a very small